He was supposed to choose the perfect family. The smiling couple with the big backyard. The retired police officer with the calm voice. Maybe the little girl clutching a pink tennis ball against her chest. But instead, the shelter puppy walked past every open hand in the room and sat silently at the boots of a man who looked like he had already lost too much to love anything again. The rain had started before sunrise over Norfolk, Virginia, coating the streets in a cold silver sheen that blurred headlights and softened the edges of old brick buildings near the harbor. Wind rolled in from the Atlantic carrying the scent of salt, wet pavement, and diesel fuel from distant ships easing through the fog. Inside Harbor Hope Animal Shelter, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant, damp fur, and burnt coffee that had been sitting too long on the warmer. Dozens of dogs barked through the concrete hallways, paws scratching against kennel doors, tails thumping like nervous drums. But Kennel 17 stayed quiet. Too quiet. Grace Holloway noticed it immediately. She stood near the front desk with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, reading glasses sliding low on her nose as she watched the small German Shepherd puppy curled against the back corner of his enclosure. 8 weeks old. Sable coat. Oversized paws. Amber eyes too serious for something so young. The tag clipped to his kennel simply read Scout. Still hasn't picked anybody, one volunteer whispered. Grace nodded slowly. No, she murmured. Feels more like he's waiting. The shelter bell chimed softly as the front door opened. Cold air drifted inside along with the scent of rain and ocean wind. Ethan Walker stepped through the doorway with his hood pulled low over dark hair streaked faintly with gray at the temples. Tall, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way old churches feel quiet after prayer. His jeans were worn, boots scuffed from years of use, and beneath the sleeve of his dark jacket rested the faded outline of a military tattoo near his wrist. A pair of dog tags disappeared beneath his shirt each time he moved. Grace recognized the posture before she recognized the man. Military. Not active anymore, but still carrying it in his spine. Ethan removed his hood slowly, rainwater sliding from the fabric onto the shelter floor. His pale green eyes drifted across the room without lingering anywhere too long. Not on the barking dogs. Not on the families smiling beside kennels. Not even on the adoption signs taped crookedly to the walls. He looked like a man who came only because silence at home had finally become louder than noise. Can I help you? Grace asked gently. Ethan shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. Just looking. His voice carried gravel and exhaustion, the kind built from too many sleepless nights. Grace started to answer, but movement down the hallway caught her eye. Scout had stood up. For the first time all morning, the puppy walked toward the kennel door. No barking, no whining, just steady steps. Ethan didn't notice him at first. He had stopped beside another enclosure, staring absently at a Labrador spinning excited circles against the gate. But Scout kept moving. One paw, then another. The puppy's ears twitched as he pressed himself quietly against the bars, eyes locked on Ethan like he recognized something nobody else could see. Grace frowned softly. That's strange, she whispered. Ethan finally turned. Their eyes met through steel bars and fluorescent light. The puppy didn't wag his tail, didn't bark. He simply sat down beside the kennel door and rested one tiny paw against the metal near Ethan's boot. Then slowly, almost reverently, Scout lowered his nose toward the faint clink of dog tags beneath Ethan's jacket. And for the first time in nearly 3 years, Ethan Walker felt something inside his chest move again. The puppy should have barked like the others. That was what unsettled Grace the most. Not the silence itself, but the way Scout watched Ethan Walker as if he had finally found someone he had been searching for long before he ever arrived at the shelter. Outside, the rain deepened over Norfolk Harbor, tapping softly against the windows while gray waves rolled beneath distant cargo ships moving through the fog. The fluorescent lights inside the shelter buzzed faintly overhead, washing the hallway in pale color that made everything feel colder than it was. Ethan stood motionless beside the kennel, staring down at the tiny German Shepherd pressed quietly against the bars. Scout did not jump, did not beg for attention. He simply stayed there, ears slightly lowered, amber eyes steady and calm. Grace folded her arms carefully. He has ignored every person that walked through here for 6 days, she said. Ethan finally looked up. Maybe he is smarter than the rest of us. The corner of Grace's mouth twitched with the beginning of a smile. Or maybe he sees something. Ethan glanced away first. Men like him were trained to scan exits, monitor reflections in glass, memorize movement without thinking. But being seen was different. Being understood was dangerous. He stepped back from the kennel slowly. Scout stood immediately. Ethan walked farther down the hallway. The puppy followed from inside the enclosure, pacing behind the steel gate with quiet determination until Ethan disappeared from view. Then Scout stopped moving entirely. Grace noticed the shift. So did Ethan. He returned a few seconds later without meaning to. The puppy sat again. Waiting. Calm. Certain. Ethan exhaled softly through his nose. That is not normal. No, Grace replied. It is not. She unlocked the kennel door carefully and crouched beside Scout. Come on, little man. The puppy stepped out slowly onto the polished concrete floor, paws too large for his tiny frame, nails clicking softly in the silence between barking echoes farther down the hall. Grace expected excitement. Instead, Scout walked directly past her and crossed the distance toward Ethan with deliberate steps. The puppy stopped beside his boots and leaned gently against his leg as if he belonged there already. Ethan stiffened. For one brief second, something crossed his face. Not fear exactly. More like memory. The kind that sneaks up quietly when a certain smell or sound slips through the cracks people build around grief. Scout tilted his head toward the faint metallic sound beneath Ethan's jacket. Dog tags. The puppy nosed the fabric lightly, then rested his chin against Ethan's knee. Grace watched the color drain slightly from Ethan's face. You served? She asked carefully. Ethan nodded once. 12 years. Army. Navy. Grace noticed the pause before he added quietly, SEAL teams. The room settled into silence again. Somewhere in the back kennels, another dog barked wildly before being hushed by a volunteer. Rainwater slid down the windows in crooked lines that caught the dull afternoon light. Ethan crouched slowly, careful like a man approaching something fragile. Scout did not retreat. The puppy pressed closer instead, small body warm against Ethan's weathered hands. His fur smelled faintly of cedar shavings and clean soap beneath the shelter scent. Ethan scratched lightly behind one ear, and the puppy closed his eyes as if the touch carried recognition deeper than comfort. Grace saw Ethan swallow hard before he spoke again. I did not come here for a dog. Maybe he did not come here for just anybody, Grace answered softly. Ethan looked down at Scout again. The puppy opened his eyes and held his gaze with strange, unwavering trust. Outside, thunder rolled low across the Atlantic coast like distant memory. And for the first time in years, Ethan Walker did not feel entirely alone in the silence. By the time Ethan left the shelter, evening had settled heavily over Norfolk Harbor. Rain still drifted across the streets in thin silver curtains, blurring traffic lights into soft streaks of red and gold against the wet pavement. The cold carried that familiar Atlantic bite that slipped beneath jackets and settled deep into old injuries. Ethan sat behind the wheel of his aging Ford truck for a long moment without starting the engine. Scout rested quietly inside the passenger seat wrapped in a gray shelter blanket, too calm for a puppy his age. Most dogs trembled during car rides. Most cried or paced. Scout simply watched Ethan with those steady amber eyes that seemed older than they should have been. The windshield fogged faintly from their breath. Ethan rubbed one hand across his jaw and stared through the rain. This is temporary, he muttered quietly, more to himself than the dog. Scout tilted his head slightly, as if listening anyway. The drive north took nearly 40 minutes through quiet coastal roads lined with soaked pine trees and shuttered seafood diners glowing faintly beneath neon signs. The farther Ethan drove from the city, the emptier the roads became. Eventually, he turned onto a narrow gravel lane disappearing into the woods near Chesapeake Bay. His cabin sat alone beneath towering cedar trees, weathered by salt air and years of storms. One porch light glowed weakly against the darkening sky. Ethan killed the engine. Silence settled immediately except for distant rain dripping through branches overhead. He stepped out first, boots crunching softly across wet gravel. Scout hesitated only a second before hopping down beside him. The puppy froze near the porch steps, nose twitching carefully. Ethan watched him sniff the air. Old wood. Motor oil. Smoke trapped deep in cedar walls. The scent of a man living alone too long. Scout climbed the steps slowly and stopped near the front door before Ethan even reached it. Again that strange certainty. Ethan unlocked the cabin and pushed the door open into darkness, scented faintly with black coffee, worn leather, and cold fireplace ash. He reached for the switch beside the doorway. Warm amber light filled the room. Scout walked inside without fear. No frantic running. No nervous pacing. Just quiet exploration. Ethan removed his jacket and tossed it across the back of a chair. The dog tags beneath his shirt clinked softly against each other. Scout stopped instantly at the sound. Ethan noticed the reaction immediately. The puppy crossed the cabin floor with deliberate little steps until he reached Ethan's boots again. Then he sat down beside them, waiting, watching. "You really are strange," Ethan whispered. He filled a bowl with water from the kitchen sink and placed it carefully on the floor. Scout drank politely, then wandered farther into the cabin. Rain tapped softly against the windows while wind moved through the cedar trees outside with a sound almost like distant surf. Ethan leaned against the counter, exhaustion settling heavily into his shoulders. He had not planned for this. The shelter had been impulse, a way to kill an empty afternoon, nothing more. Yet now there was a living creature moving through the silence of his home like it belonged there. Scout disappeared briefly down the hallway. Ethan frowned. "Hey." Tiny nails clicked softly against hardwood floors somewhere near the back bedroom. Ethan followed slowly. The hallway walls carried old framed photographs from another life. Navy graduation. Team training near Coronado. Smiling faces under desert sunlight. Men standing shoulder to shoulder before deployments none of them talked about afterward. Scout sat motionless near the final door at the end of the hall. Ethan stopped cold. The puppy had somehow found the one room Ethan never entered anymore. The door stood partially open, shadows resting quietly beyond it. Scout looked back at Ethan once before nudging the door wider with his nose. Inside, untouched beneath a thin layer of dust, sat an old military footlocker beside the bed. And for the first time in nearly 3 years, Ethan felt his heartbeat stumble against memory. Some rooms do not stay empty. They hold their breath. They wait. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway while rain whispered against the cabin roof and cold wind moved softly through the cedar trees outside. The bedroom door remained half open before him, shadows resting quietly across furniture untouched for years. Scout sat at the threshold without moving, small body still, amber eyes fixed on the old military footlocker beside the bed. Ethan felt tension crawl slowly through his chest. "No," he murmured under his breath. "Not that room." His voice sounded weaker than he intended. Scout glanced back once, ears twitching gently, then stepped inside anyway. The puppy moved carefully across the hardwood floor, paws muffled by the layer of dust settled over everything. Ethan had not entered this room in nearly 3 years. Not since the funeral. Not since Norfolk Naval Chapel filled with folded flags, polished shoes, and silence too heavy for words. The air inside still carried traces of cedar wood and old detergent trapped deep within blankets no one used anymore. A framed photograph rested crooked on the dresser beside a dead bedside lamp. 3 men in desert uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder beneath brutal Middle Eastern sunlight, smiling. At something outside the frame. Ethan, Noah Briggs, Daniel Mercer. Brothers in every way that mattered except blood. Ethan looked away quickly. Scout reached the footlocker and stopped. The puppy lowered his nose toward the weathered green metal, as if recognizing its scent. Then softly, deliberately, he pawed once against the latch. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. "Scout." The puppy pawed again. A small metallic click echoed quietly through the room. Ethan crossed the floor before he realized he was moving. "Enough." His voice came sharper now, rough with something deeper than irritation. Scout immediately sat down, silent again, but he did not retreat. Ethan stared at the footlocker for a long moment. Dust coated the lid except for the faint mark left by the puppy's paw. He rubbed one hand across his face slowly. Sleep had become difficult after Noah died. Then impossible. Some nights Ethan still woke expecting radio static in the dark or boots crossing gravel outside the barracks. Other nights, he dreamed of ocean wind and helicopter blades cutting through rain. But the worst nights were always quiet. Because quiet left room for memory. He crouched slowly before the footlocker, knees stiff from old injuries and colder weather settling into his joints. Scout moved closer immediately, pressing lightly against Ethan's leg. The warmth surprised him. He rested one hand absently against the puppy's back while staring at the rusted latch. You really do not know when to quit, he whispered. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over Chesapeake Bay. Ethan finally opened the footlocker. The hinges groaned softly after years unopened. A faint scent escaped immediately. Gun oil. Salt air. Old canvas. Beneath neatly folded uniforms rested sealed mission folders, worn notebooks, patches from deployments overseas, and photographs curled slightly at the corners with age. Scout leaned forward slowly, sniffing everything with strange focus. Then suddenly the puppy froze. His ears lifted sharply. Ethan noticed it instantly. Scout moved deeper into the locker and nudged something hidden beneath a folded tin sweatshirt. Ethan frowned and pulled the fabric aside. A smaller box sat. Underneath. Plain cardboard. Military shipping label faded nearly white with time. Ethan stared at it without breathing for a second. The handwriting across the top stopped his heart cold. Noah Briggs. The letters were unmistakable. Messy. Slanted slightly upward. Ethan had seen that handwriting on mission notes, Christmas cards, cheap diner receipts during deployments overseas. His throat tightened painfully. Scout whimpered softly for the first time since entering the room. Ethan opened the box carefully. Inside rested a faded leather puppy collar no larger than his hand. Beside it lay an unopened letter sealed inside a plastic bag. And beneath both items sat a photograph of Noah, kneeling beside a full-grown German shepherd with dark sable fur and intelligent amber eyes, almost identical to Scout's. Ethan stared at the image while cold rain tapped steadily against the cabin windows. Then very quietly, Scout pressed his nose against Noah's photograph and laid down beside it like he had finally found his way home. Rain continued through most of the night, steady and soft against the cabin roof, while cold wind drifted through the cedar trees outside, like whispers moving between graves. Ethan sat alone on the bedroom floor with the cardboard box resting open beside him and Scout curled quietly against his leg. The old photograph remained in Ethan's hands. Noah Briggs grinned beneath desert sunlight, one arm resting proudly across the shoulders of the sable German shepherd beside him. The dog's ears stood tall and alert, amber eyes sharp with intelligence and calm loyalty. There was something almost unsettling about the resemblance. Scout had the same eyes, the same dark streak running down the bridge of his nose. Ethan swallowed slowly. Noah, he whispered into the silence. The room smelled faintly of dust, cedarwood, and rain drifting through cracked window seals. Scout lifted his head the moment Ethan spoke the name. Not excited, not startled, just attentive, listening. Ethan stared at the unopened letter sealed carefully inside weathered plastic. His pulse felt heavier now, slower somehow. For years he had avoided this room because grief behaved like ocean. Tide. Ignore it long enough and eventually it quieted, at least on the surface. But tonight the tide had returned. Ethan pulled the letter free carefully. The envelope crackled softly in his hands. Across the front, Noah's handwriting leaned crooked and familiar beneath faded black ink. If you were reading this, Walker, then things probably got weird. Ethan almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, he sat motionless while rain tapped against the windows and Scout pressed closer against him as though sensing the storm moving quietly beneath his ribs. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside rested a single folded sheet of paper and an old receipt from a breeder outside San Diego. Ethan recognized the date immediately, 3 weeks before Noah's final deployment. His chest tightened painfully. He unfolded the letter. Walker, if this gets to you, then I probably ran out of chances to annoy you in person. So congratulations. You finally get some peace and quiet. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Noah always wrote like he talked. Even now, the words carried his voice through the room, clear as memory. The breeder says the litter should be born around October. Bloodline traces back to military K9 stock out of Nevada. Smart dogs. Stubborn too. Figured that fits our team pretty well. Ethan's fingers tightened against the paper. Scout shifted softly beside him, but never looked away. I was going to pick one up after deployment. Nothing fancy. Just wanted something loyal waiting around after all this ends. Maybe that sounds stupid. Maybe getting older does that to a man. Ethan breathed slowly through his nose. Outside, thunder rolled low across Chesapeake Bay. The next lines nearly stopped his heart. If something happens to me before then, promise me one thing. Make sure the puppy still gets home. Ethan lowered the letter halfway. Silence swallowed the room completely except for rain and the faint hum of wind outside. Scout rested his chin gently across Ethan's boot beside the old puppy collar from the box. Ethan stared down at him in disbelief. "No," he whispered quietly. "There is no way." Yet deep inside, something already knew. He looked back toward the photograph again. The full-grown shepherd beside Noah wore the exact same leather collar, now lying beside Scout on the floor. Ethan remembered the dog instantly. Ranger, Noah's old military K-9 partner before retirement. Loyal to the point of insanity. Noah used to joke that Ranger trusted dogs more than people anyway. Ethan looked down slowly at Scout again. The puppy's amber eyes reflected the dim bedside lamp, with quiet understanding far too deep for something so young. Then Scout leaned forward gently and nudged the folded letter closer toward Ethan's hand, as if finishing a promise that had been traveling through darkness for years just to find its way back home. Morning arrived slowly over Chesapeake Bay, pale gray light slipping through cedar branches while mist drifted low across the shoreline beyond Ethan's cabin. The storm had passed during the night, leaving rainwater trembling from pine needles and the smell of wet earth hanging heavy in the cold air. Inside the cabin, the fireplace crackled softly for the first time in months. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with black coffee growing cold beside him and Noah's letter unfolded carefully beneath one hand. Scout slept near the chair legs, small body curled tightly against Ethan's boots as though guarding something precious. Ethan had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, memories surfaced. Noah laughing during training drills in Coronado. Noah singing terribly inside military trucks just to irritate everyone else. Noah standing on a dock at sunset holding a leash attached to Ranger while swearing someday he would disappear into the mountains and spend the rest of his life fishing with a dog smarter than most people. Ethan stared down at the puppy sleeping beside him now. "You should not even exist," he whispered quietly. Scout's ears twitched at the sound of Ethan's voice, but he did not wake. The old receipt from the breeder remained beside the letter. Ethan had spent half the night searching names online, tracing military breeding records tied to retired K-9 bloodlines. Most of it led nowhere. Dead websites, old phone numbers, forgotten records buried beneath years. Until one detail stopped him cold. Ranger, Noah's retired. Shepherd had been transferred after Noah died to a private handler program outside Virginia Beach. Ethan remembered signing paperwork through blurred grief and exhaustion. He had not asked questions afterward. Could not. The coffee tasted bitter and burnt. Ethan pushed the mug aside and leaned back slowly while morning wind rattled the windows faintly. Scout finally stirred awake, stretching awkward, oversized paws across the floorboards before walking directly toward Ethan without hesitation. Again that certainty, that strange, unwavering trust. Ethan rubbed a hand across the puppy's head carefully. "You really found me," he murmured. Scout licked Ethan's wrist once before trotting toward the back door. Ethan frowned. Already. The puppy sat beside the door waiting patiently. Ethan grabbed his old canvas jacket from the hook near the entrance and stepped outside with Scout following close behind. The morning air cut cold against his face. Pine trees swayed softly overhead, while fog drifted through the woods in pale ribbons touched by early sunlight. Ethan walked toward the shoreline path automatically, boots pressing into damp earth darkened by rain. Scout stayed close at first. Then suddenly the puppy stopped near an old cedar stump beside the trail. Ethan kept walking 2 more steps before realizing Scout had not followed. He turned back. The puppy was digging. Not playful digging. Focused. Determined. Wet dirt scattered behind tiny paws while Scout worked urgently against the roots of the stump. Ethan sighed softly. "What now?" Scout whined quietly without looking up. Ethan crouched beside him and brushed mud aside carefully with both hands. Something metallic rested beneath the dirt. His stomach tightened instantly. He pulled free a weathered ammunition tin sealed tightly with rust along the edges. Rainwater dripped from cedar branches overhead, while Ethan stared silently at the container in disbelief. Scout sat beside him breathing hard, tail brushing softly against the wet ground. Ethan opened the tin slowly. Inside rested several old photographs wrapped carefully in plastic, a silver Navy Challenge coin, and another folded note written in Noah's unmistakable handwriting. Ethan felt cold spread through his chest despite the morning sun breaking faintly through the trees. One photograph showed Noah sitting beside Ranger near this exact shoreline years earlier. Another showed Ranger carrying a tiny sable-colored puppy gently in his mouth across the grass. Scout. Ethan's hands trembled slightly now. He unfolded the second note carefully. Walker, if Ranger ever brings the puppy back here, it means he remembered. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. Wind moved softly across Chesapeake Bay while Scout leaned quietly against his side beneath the cedar trees. And somewhere deep beneath years of grief and silence, Ethan finally began to understand that loyalty did not always end when life did. The days that followed felt different inside the cabin. Not louder, not brighter, just less empty. Morning sunlight began reaching farther across the hardwood floors while the scent of fresh coffee and cedar smoke slowly replaced the stale silence that had settled there for years. Scout moved through the house like he had memorized it long ago. He learned where Ethan kept the blankets before Ethan ever showed him. He waited beside the back door every dawn for their walks near Chesapeake Bay. And each night, without fail, he curled beside Ethan's bed just before the old nightmares usually arrived. Somehow they came less often now. Ethan noticed it quietly. He slept longer, breathed easier. The sharp tension that once followed him room to room had begun loosening like knots unraveling one thread at a time. One cold Thursday morning, Scout sat beside the kitchen table watching Ethan shave for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. "Do not look so surprised," Ethan muttered toward the puppy's reflection in the bathroom mirror. Scout tilted his head with exaggerated seriousness. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. The puppy had developed strange habits. He hated thunderstorms, but loved ocean wind. He carried Ethan's socks room to room like sacred artifacts. And every evening around sunset, Scout sat beside the old footlocker in silence, as if standing watch over Noah's memory. Ethan stopped trying to explain it. Some things did not need explaining. Late that afternoon, Ethan drove into town for supplies with Scout riding quietly beside him in the truck. Norfolk Harbor glowed beneath pale winter sunlight, while gulls circled fishing boats drifting near the docks. It was the first time Ethan had voluntarily entered town in months without immediately wanting to leave. Scout watched everything through the passenger window with alert amber eyes while country music hummed softly through old speakers crackling with static. Ethan stopped outside a small hardware store near Main Street. As soon as he stepped onto the sidewalk, someone called his name. "Walker." Ethan turned slowly. Daniel Mercer stood near the storefront, holding 2 paper coffee cups beneath one arm. Older now, more gray around the temples, but still carrying that same steady marine posture Ethan remembered from years ago. For a moment, neither man spoke. Cold wind swept down the street, carrying the scent of salt water and diesel from the harbor. Then Daniel's eyes drifted downward toward Scout, standing calmly beside Ethan's leg. The color faded slightly from his face. "No way," Daniel whispered. Ethan frowned. "What?" Daniel crouched slowly in front of the puppy, staring at the dark sable markings along Scout's back. "That coat," he murmured. "Those eyes." Scout stepped forward without hesitation and pressed gently against Daniel's hand. Daniel looked up at Ethan with disbelief written across his face. "Walker," he said carefully, "that dog looks exactly like Ranger." Ethan glanced toward Scout again, pulse tightening quietly inside his chest. "I know." Daniel exhaled slowly. After Noah died, Ranger disappeared from the handler program for almost 3 weeks. Ethan blinked once. "What?" "Nobody could find him," Daniel continued softly. "They thought the old dog wandered off to die somewhere." Wind rattled the American flag hanging above the hardware store, while distant gulls cried over the harbor. Daniel stared at Scout again like he was seeing a ghost move through sunlight. "Then one morning Ranger just came back," he said, "covered in mud. Exhausted, but calm." Ethan felt cold move slowly beneath his skin. Nobody knew where he went. Daniel shook his head once. "No, but Noah used to bring Ranger out near the bay all the time." His eyes lifted toward Ethan carefully now. There was one place Noah always said felt peaceful enough to leave pieces of himself behind. Ethan's throat tightened instantly because he already knew the place. The cedar shoreline behind the cabin. The same shoreline where Scout had led him to the buried ammunition tin beneath the trees. Scout sat quietly between them now, tail brushing softly against the sidewalk while harbor wind moved through his fur like ocean tide returning home. Winter settled deeper along Chesapeake Bay over the following week, wrapping the shoreline in cold silver mornings and long blue evenings where fog drifted low between cedar trees like slow-moving ghosts. The cabin no longer felt abandoned. Scout had changed that without effort. Small signs of life now filled the rooms Ethan once avoided. A chew toy beside the fireplace. Tiny muddy paw prints near the back door. Soft breathing at the foot of the bed every night. The silence still existed, but it no longer felt empty. It felt shared. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan stood at the kitchen sink washing coffee grounds from an old mug while Scout sat nearby watching snow begin to fall beyond the windows. Thick flakes drifted lazily across the shoreline, covering the dock and cedar roots in fresh white stillness. Ethan glanced toward the puppy and shook his head faintly. "You have officially ruined peaceful loneliness for me," Scout answered with a soft huff before trotting suddenly toward the hallway. Ethan barely noticed at first. Then came the familiar sound. Scratching. Focused. Persistent. Ethan sighed quietly and followed him down the hall. Scout sat beside the old footlocker again. The puppy pawed once against the metal lid, then looked directly at Ethan. "We already opened it," Ethan muttered. Scout pawed harder this time. Ethan frowned slowly. Something about the urgency felt different. He crouched beside the trunk and lifted the lid open once more. Old uniforms. Mission folders. Photographs. Nothing new. Scout immediately pushed his nose beneath a folded navy sweatshirt near the bottom corner. Ethan moved the fabric aside carefully. Hidden underneath rested a narrow leather journal Ethan had never seen before. Dust coated the cover. Noah Briggs was burned faintly into the front leather in worn gold letters. Ethan stared silently for a long moment while snow whispered against the cabin windows. Then slowly he opened it. Most pages contained ordinary things. Fishing spots Noah wanted to visit someday. Sketches of mountain cabins. Terrible attempts at poetry written during deployments overseas. Ethan almost smiled reading them. Almost. Then near the back, one page stopped him cold. "If Ranger ever finds the pup again, trust him. Dogs remember what we bury inside ourselves better than people do." Ethan swallowed hard. Scout rested his chin gently across Ethan's knee while the fireplace crackled softly in the next room. Ethan turned another page. There, folded carefully between journal entries, rested a photograph he had never seen before. Noah stood smiling beside Ranger near the Chesapeake shoreline years earlier. But this time another figure stood partially visible beside them. Ethan, younger, laughing at something outside the frame with his hand resting absent-mindedly on Ranger's head. Scout stared at the picture with complete stillness. Ethan's chest tightened painfully. He barely remembered that day. Yet the shoreline behind them was unmistakable. The cedar trees. The old dock. The exact place where Scout had found the buried ammunition tin. Noah's final journal entry sat beneath the photograph. "Walker still thinks grief is something you survive alone. Maybe one day Ranger will prove him wrong." Ethan stopped reading. Outside, snow drifted silently through the trees while pale afternoon light faded across Chesapeake Bay. The room blurred slightly around him. Not from weakness. Not from exhaustion. From something heavier. Something he had spent years refusing to feel. Scout moved closer quietly until his warm body rested fully against Ethan's side. No barking. No whining. Just presence. Steady and patient. Ethan lowered one trembling hand into the puppy's fur and closed his eyes. For years he had believed Noah's story ended with folded flags and military silence. But now the truth stood breathing beside him on four oversized paws beneath the soft glow of winter light. And somewhere deep within the ache he carried, Ethan finally understood that Noah had never really left him behind. Spring arrived quietly along Chesapeake Bay, softening the cold edges of winter and filling the shoreline with the scent of salt water, pine sap, and fresh rain warming beneath longer afternoons. The cedar trees behind Ethan's cabin had begun turning green again, their branches swaying gently above the narrow path leading toward the water. Scout had grown fast over the past months. His oversized paws finally matched the lean strength forming beneath his sable coat, and his amber eyes carried the same calm intelligence Ethan remembered from Ranger years ago. Every morning before sunrise, the two walked the shoreline together beneath pale orange skies while gulls drifted over the bay and fishing boats hummed faintly in the distance. People in town had started noticing the change in Ethan too. He no longer moved through Norfolk Harbor like a ghost avoiding eye contact. He spoke more, smiled occasionally. Some afternoons, he even stayed long enough at the diner near Main Street to finish a second cup of coffee while Scout rested beneath the table collecting scraps of bacon from amused waitresses who pretended not to notice. The grief never disappeared completely. Ethan knew now that it never would. But grief no longer felt like drowning. It felt more like carrying something sacred. Heavy sometimes. Beautiful too. One warm evening near Memorial Day, Ethan loaded the old Ford truck with a folded camping chair, a lantern, and the weathered cedar box containing Noah's letters and journal. Scout jumped easily into the passenger seat beside him, tail brushing against the worn leather bench. The drive took them north along the coastline until city lights faded behind fields and pine forests washed gold beneath the setting sun. Arlington National Cemetery rested beneath a quiet evening sky when they finally arrived. White headstones stretched across rolling green hills like rows of silent prayers catching the last light of day. Wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the faint scent of fresh cut grass and distant rain. Ethan walked slowly through the cemetery with Scout close beside him. Families spoke quietly in the distance while small American flags stirred beside marble stones glowing softly beneath sunset colors. Eventually, Ethan stopped near a familiar grave. Noah Briggs, United States Navy, beloved son, loyal friend. Ethan stood there for a long moment without speaking. Scout sat quietly beside the headstone, ears lowered gently against the breeze. Ethan placed the cedar box carefully on the grass and removed the old leather puppy collar from inside. Time had darkened the leather, but Noah's initials remained faintly carved into the metal clasp. Ethan stared at it while emotion tightened silently inside his chest. He made it home, he whispered softly. Scout rose slowly and stepped closer to the grave. With careful movements, the shepherd lowered himself beside the headstone and rested his chin against the cold marble exactly the way Ranger used to during deployments whenever Noah sat nearby, cleaning gear beneath desert stars. Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs. Tears came quietly then. No shaking, no collapse. Just silent tears slipping down the face of a man who had spent years trying to survive without allowing himself to heal. Wind moved softly through the cemetery trees while sunset faded into deep blue evening over Arlington. Ethan rested one hand against Scout's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath thick fur. "You found me for a reason," he whispered. Scout lifted his head slightly at the sound of Ethan's voice and leaned gently into his hand. Nearby, hundreds of flags fluttered softly beneath the evening sky. And in that peaceful silence between grief and grace, Ethan finally understood something Noah had known all along. Some promises do not end with death. Some loyalties keep walking beside us until we are finally ready to come home.